Hello, everyone. So I'm Anne-Marie Amoir, and I'm a consultant to PFMD, and I co-lead the work in progress on involving patients in the development of PLS, together with other stakeholders, of course. So this session is really focusing on the topic of plain language summary of peer-reviewed publications. I think I want to make it clear. It's not about clinical trials. It's here the peer-reviewed publication, and it's all about a stepwise approach for co-creation with multiple stakeholders. Good. Next slide. We are above 70. We have 75.
75, yeah.
Okay, so okay, just to put in the context of this workshop. So this workshop is part of the Patient Engagement Open Forum virtual sessions. So, so it's a series of virtual events that will take place this year. So starting yesterday already, and we'll continue with additional session in July, in September, in October. And so the plan is really to work together in a multi-stakeholder context. And I think typically here, that's really what we follow as principle, and the ambition is to really turn it from aspiration on patient engagement in a reality. So some housekeeping, because we are a large group, so we expect a lot of engagement, of feedback, so that's really important on all this working or workshop. We would like to ask all microphones on mute, please, because otherwise it's really going to be complicated. And when you want to provide questions or any feedback during the workshop, please use the chat box, okay? Just for your information, this session will be recorded. And a key message at the end, let's make it interesting all together. So thank you for your time. Next slide. I have the pleasure to, can we go back first on the previous slide? Yeah. I have the pleasure to introduce somebody who was deeply involved in the early reflection on the need to have patients involved in the elaboration of plain language summaries. Sheila Kawaja has worked with us from the early stage, and it was quite natural for us to let her set the scene. So the floor is to you, Sheila. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for the wonderful words and the introduction. Welcome, everybody. I will be your host for today, and I will guide you through the various parts of the session. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so before I show you the agenda, I would like to share with you the objective of the workshop. This is an opportunity not only to explain to you the benefits and the challenges of the plain language summaries, but also the importance that the co-creation aspect involves a number of multi-stakeholders. Because ultimately what we want to do is to ensure that scientific research and publications are made accessible and understandable to the general public. We want to become more familiar with the concept of PLS, and ultimately we want you to be introduced to our how-to guide on how to create a PLS. Next slide. So as you can see, this is an agenda. It is extremely packed. we are now in the first phase where I will be setting the scene and welcoming the speakers towards the end. The first part will be devoted to sharing the aspects from 3 different key stakeholders, which is the editor, the industry, and the patient, because we believe that each one comes with different experience and can offer different perspectives, and understand how a patient engagement can be of value to their sector. At the end of that, we will have a Q&A session. So it is very important that while we all present, you can type in your questions or your comments in the chat box. We will have a moderator who will select the questions that are most relevant. Then we will be going into breakout sessions. I'm sure that many of you have had Zoom exhaust in the past months. So you know that breakout sessions have been created by the technical team. You will be shown a typical PLS. I really hope that each of you has had the time to look at the pre-reads that we shared with you in the past couple of days. And what we want to do in this breakout session is really to get your input, because with your feedback and your contribution, we are then going to use it to improve our current stage of the Howto module. And after that, we will come back, we will basically be thrown back into the plenary room, and each moderator will share the key aspects that were shared by the participants. Now, while we welcome compliments, those make us feel good, what we really want is suggestions from you on how to improve it, all right? And last but not least, in the last 10 minutes, we want, Anne-Marie will be taking over. She will be explaining the last few steps and sharing with you what the satisfaction survey will be all about. Right, so it is important, like in any conference, that we get to know each other. So you know a little bit about me, but I would now like to shortly pass the floor to each of my colleagues, Elena, Thomas, and Lori. And Elena, could you please take the floor and briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Elena Conroy. I'm a managing editor at Sage Publishing in the London office. I've been in publishing for about 6 years, and I've been with Sage for 3.5, and I manage a portfolio of biomedical journals.
Next is me, Thomas. Yeah, Thomas Schindler. I'm a medical writer and head of a new group called Innovation Medical Writing at Boehringer Ingelheim. And I have extensive background in providing lay language documents, particularly lay summaries for clinical trial results, but also PLSS to various audiences. And I contributed to the work stream, and I'm happy to provide the view of industry to this audience.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name's Lori Arnstein. I'm Patient Partnership Scientific Liaison at Envision Pharma Group. I'm actually a medical doctor by background, but I then moved into medical writing. I have about 3 years of medical writing experience, and I've been in a patient-focused role now for about 2 years. And a big part of that for me is my special interest in scientific communication for broad audiences, and plain language summaries of publications are a really big part of that.
Thank you, Lori. Okay. Right, so before we dive into the second part, I need to set the context for you. So it is quite clear that in the PEOF from last year, scientific information for patients was identified as a priority. And this is not only in the clinical trials aspect, but also when it comes to simple scientific research information. And if you really want patient engagement to have value for you in whatever sector you work, you have to make sure that the patients are informed. This implies that they must also have access to information. But not all patients are patient advocates and have the experience of those who collaborate more intensely with pharma industry and diverse multi-stakeholders. Sometimes it is the general population who also wants to have access to this research information. Now, we all know that the information on scientific journals on the platforms can be extremely technical. They have jargon and, well, quite a turnoff for the general population. So the other stakeholder that can really benefit from this is the HCPs. So anybody, whether it's a general practitioner, a nurse, a specialist, anybody who works in the professional healthcare environment. Why is that? Because PLSs enable the specialists, the HCP, to have a better dialogue with the patient. Because in the end, what the expert is handing over with the PLS, with the scientific research information, is scientific information that is understandable and that can help the patient better understand not only their own disorder, but also the medical options that are available, and therefore make a better informed choice on their treatment, which will then lead to a better quality of life. And last but not least, you have to also consider that at the current state, most PLS involvement, where there's patient engagement involvement, the patient comes towards the later stage. So when we are already looking at the review process of an article. But we want to change that, which is why we created the How-To module. Next stage. Okay, so we set to the task of creating a How-To module. First of all, there are two key aspects. One of all is that you have to consider that there is a vast array of stakeholders involved. And that's where co-creation comes in. It can't be limited to a certain number, but you have to involve a number of people and expertise. Even in the presentations of the co-leaders today, you saw there was a patient, there was an industry, there was publishing, and there was an expert from the medical communication. So already there you can see that the people involved are quite vast, and the expertise. Last of all, we wanted to create a practical how-to guide. So it will explain step by step what you have to do, at what part. They are recommendations, but what we recommend will ensure that patient engagement will come at as early as possible. And basically, the PLS wants to ensure that the patient engagement is present and available at all phases. Next page. All right, so now what I'm going to do is briefly go through our 5-step approach. Can't go into great detail because it is a how-to guide. Now, those who were present last year, you may remember that we presented a toolkit which was created in collaboration with Envision. As a result of that, we then set out to create this how-to guide. And these are the 5 steps. Now, one of the first steps you have to do is you have to think about the scope and the prioritization. What does that mean? That means you have to determine if, first of all, the journal website already mandates the PLS, or if they recommend it. Do you want patient engagement at this stage, or do you want it later? What kind of resources are you going to use? Is there funding for this? So this is basically the planning stage, okay? Now, remember step one, because I would like patient engagement to start from the very beginning, okay? Step two, just like with any journal, with any magazine, with any newspaper, you have to identify your target audience. Scientific articles on journals are usually aimed at researchers, doctors, people with a higher level of degree. But you actually want to share this with somebody. So you have to determine who will benefit from this PLS. Okay. Then once you have decided the target audience, you have to decide what is the best way to disseminate. Now, disseminate means sharing it. Nowadays, everybody lives on internet, and therefore, where do you get your information? I know I, as a patient, I have 2 or 3 main sources. I go to reliable websites for medical information. I go to Twitter. I go to Facebook. Somebody please turn off the audio. So I was saying, so you go through reliable resources. So Facebook, in the patient groups, you have Twitter, you can follow as many journals as you can, and you can go through patient groups, and there are many open access journals. So it's quite a bit. But what you want to do is you want to reach the general population, okay? Then, who do you want to be part of your co-creation? So this is, yes, you have your researcher, but what kind of patient do you want? Do you want them to help you if you're writing an article for the results of a clinical trial? Do you want them to start at the beginning so they are part of the process and they could even perhaps co-authorship? That's another story. Or do you want them to be at the review stage of the PLS? Now remember, this is part 3, and this is the stage where the patient usually comes in when you write the PLS. So who writes the PLS? Usually it is the author, okay? And then in an appropriate group of people, patients come in and other people, they review if the PLS written is understandable to the general population. Usually the patient advisors, they can make recommendations to the author. I think this should be better in bullet points, so the format is very important. With internet, we have a very limited amount of attention, right? So I can't imagine having to go through a long list of having to look for keywords. I would much prefer a bullet point, but that's me. So these are considerations you have to take into account, right? Then you have the dissemination, which brings you back to point 2. Now, dissemination, the more people you consider to disseminate, the better the potential impact it is. So I'm sure if you're a researcher, you have your list of colleagues. If you're a doctor, you have your experts, you go to conferences, etc. You want to give visibility to your article anyway, right? But this is an additional. So who's really going to help you disseminate the PLS? Well, the GPs, the specialists, if you have a good relationship with them, and most of all, the patient organizations, because they are the ones who have access to the patient community, the general population, who want to know about this but don't have access to it, right? Now, with any kind of work we do, whether it's in the office, whether we write an article, we do a surgery, etc., we want to be able to understand how successful we are. So how do you track this? Well, If you have published articles for journals, you know that the journal websites have their own tracking system. If you collaborate with patient organizations, they can tell you their readership in their mailing lists, and you just have to just touch base with everybody. With social media, you can find out how many have clicked on it. So there's diverse ways. So as you can see, this goes from the planning stage to the tracking, okay? This is very short. How-to guide is much more complete, all right? Next phase, please. Now, as I mentioned before, this is just one of the 6 or 7 working groups that have started since last year. Look at the right side of the screen. Look at all the contributors just in this group. And as you can see, they are quite well distributed, okay? Now, there were co-leads, and we welcome. So if at the end of this session, after we send out the results of the consultation, you wish to take part, okay, please reach out to us, because we really want to hear you and see you participate. Okay, because I'm sure each one of us has different perspective and can bring different experiences to the table. Now, we aim to share disseminate the results of this by the end of 2020. And then in the first part of 2021, we will start with the pilots. Okay? All right, thank you. Next. All right, now we start in the other session where each one of us will bring their own perspective of what it means to be involved in the PLS. Okay? Lori?
I think we've got Eleanor. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay. Thank you very much, Daniela. Okay, so hello again, everyone. My name is Elena Conroy. As I mentioned, I'm a managing editor at Sage Publishing. I've been there for a couple of years. I manage a portfolio of bioclinical journals, and one of them is Therapeutic Advances in Drug Safety, which you see right here on the slide. So my kind of role today is give you a bit of, like kind of a short timeline of experience of how it looks like in publishing, a publishing perspective, and basically just tell you about my experience in implementing PLS in therapeutic advances in drug safety. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a bit about the implementation and how that worked. So the implementation of PLS started last year in November. So what this means is that from that time, we basically changed our submission guidelines, and we now ask authors to submit a PLS with every original research article. So along with the article, we now request obviously a normal scientific abstract, but also a PLS. So as I said, that's been going on since November. Therapeutic Advances in Drug Safety is an open access journal. So another reason we really wanted to, trial this on this particular journal is because it is an open access journal, which means it's accessible to all and from anywhere. So of course, we want to trial this on a journal that is accessible, because we didn't want this to be behind a paywall, because it kind of really defeats the purpose of disseminating the PLS and kind of spreading the word. So this came about from a big collaborative effort, so both externally and internally. So how it all started really was me meeting Sheila at a conference, and she introduced me to PFMD, and PFMD very kindly took me on to do this wonderful project. And basically, well, to give you a bit of a background, Sage had been thinking for numerous years to introduce PLS in our journals. However, there was a bit of hesitancy because of not being sure whether the PLS would be read, whether they were important enough, whether people were interested. And literally one conversation later with Sheila was all I needed to know that this is important. You know, we need to empower patients, educate patients, and so on. And we want to give them access to research. So basically, this is how it happened, through collaborating with PFMD as well. And internally, it was a big collaborative effort because we had to change, you know, some of the process, so the publishing process. So we had to adapt it to make sure that the PLS could be included and efficient throughout the process. So this means, you know, from the guidelines, as I explained, to, you know, instruct the authors to do this, from the submission process through to peer review, and finally the final production stage. So we also recently created a patient advisory board, which I'm incredibly excited about. This patient advisory board is actually part of the editorial board of the journal. So they're there and there to stay. They're not going anywhere. And basically what they're doing is they're gonna basically, you know, help us, basically advise us on best practice, right? We can't do this without the experts. And it's been wonderful because so far the advisory board is relatively small, but we're trying to increase it. But so far it's quite diverse. There's people from different backgrounds, which is fantastic. Lastly, these patient advisory, the board, the members are going to also be PLS peer reviewers. So this is what we're developing at the moment. We want that every research article that has a PLS will go through normal scientific review by experts from the field, but also a PLS peer reviewer that can assess the PLS and ensure that the contents reflect the research. This is very important, and this is being developed at the moment, and hopefully by end of July, this will all be implemented. Next slide, please, Daniela. Thanks very much. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the benefits and challenges within a publishing field or sphere. So of course, the number one thing is it's essential for patient involvement, education, and empowerment. I think that's been the main driver for us to do this, especially for a journal like Therapeutic Advances in Drug Safety. Patient centricity is very, very important. So it just felt natural that this, you know, that we implement PLS into the journal. Furthermore, this is actually a really effective communication tool that allows researchers and the authors who submit to reach a much wider audience. So Sheila actually mentioned this earlier. So at the moment, this is shared between experts in the field, which of course is important to progress research and science. However, especially in a clinical field, I mean, the research is done for the patient. So it's only natural that the patient understands the results and the research that are carried out. And examples of this are, of course, you know, patient organizations sharing their research with the PLS to their patients from different backgrounds. And furthermore, we basically tweet every article that is online on Twitter. And the first time we did this with a PLS article, it was very well received. So that was great to see. It's slowly also becoming an industry standard. So, I mean, we see it much more. So we see publishers are already doing this. Many more journals are doing this. We get pre-submission requests about this all the time.
That's so cute.
Yeah, so this is something that we're kind of being ubiquitous, and we see it a lot in conferences. People speak about this a lot, and in a clinical trial setting as well. However, there's still some hesitancy in publishing. I can't speak for other publishers, but from speaking to colleagues throughout the industry, hesitancy comes a little bit from, you know, the changes that need to be done throughout the processes, whether that's even feasible, the scale up, also really not knowing how important PLS are. And this is also from personal experience. We didn't know how essential this was, you know, to reach the patient. And also maybe a lack of maybe centralized guidelines. There are fantastic guidelines out there. However, there's no centralized one, and maybe that can look a bit scary for someone who tries to implement this, because where do you look and which guidelines do you use? But hopefully this will change very soon. And of course, I mean, there's still a lot to learn. This project is in its infancy at Sage, and it's going to be a learning curve, and we've got challenges ahead. But I mean, we feel much more confident now that we have a patient advisory board and been collaborating with PFMD. It's been really essential to, you know, make sure we go, in the right direction, and, their advice and recommendations have been, priceless really to this. And so we're really grateful. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next steps for PLS in this journal / at Sage. So it is really important that we develop an internal PLS instruction or guide. We really want to encourage other journals within the company to take this up. And what I want to do is kind of also obviously base it on my own experience with therapeutic advances in drug safety, but also, link out to external resources and guides such as the PFMD guide for PLS. And obviously the aim there is to roll it out to more open access journals. There's already been some interest, some journals really wanting to try it out, editors asking me about it. So that's been really fantastic. And throughout also, I really want to ensure that Sage and the company prioritizes the positive impacts this has on patient education. I've been speaking about this kind of nonstop since November. People are tired of hearing it, but it's just such a passion project, and I've had really good responses throughout our editorial department, but other departments as well, and also across, offices. So our office in the USA have been asking me about this, so that's been a really great response. In the future, we'd also like to increase accessibility, so include infographics, visual aids, translating PLS where necessary, and also include patient perspectives into our journal to give really, publish, the patient perspective essentially. And of course, I've said it before and I'll say it again, continued collaboration with patients and the patient organization. So this is essential, and we could not do it without them. For example, our current patient advisory board, as I said, it's quite small and it's growing, but it's, we've got people from different backgrounds. So Sheila is one of them, and she's from WAPO, which is the World Alliance of Pituitary Organizations. And then we've got two patient experts from EUPATI, the European Patients Academy, and I believe Paula Kruger is also in this call, and she's part of it as well, and she's been a fantastic collaborator for this. And then last but absolutely not least, spreading the word. We really hope that by doing this and by speaking about this and speaking about our experience, other publishers will follow suit and feel more comfortable and encouraged to do this. And so hopefully this will, encourage them to do that and give them the confidence they need to take this on. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions during the Q&A.
This is Pulvia. Can you help?
All right, so I will now share my perspective, or the patient's perspective, one patient perspective. I certainly do not speak for everybody, but it will be my take on this experience and the usefulness of PLS. Next slide, please. All right, so whenever I speak at whatever event I'm at, I'm always wearing two hats. One is the single patient advocate, and the other one is always thinking of the greater goodness of the community. So I always have to think of what is good for me and what is good for the community through the patient organization. In either cases, there is great opportunity and value. The value I see the biggest is through the patient organization, because they are the ones who understand and act as a bridge through both multi-stakeholders and the people who are behind us, so the general public. Through the patient organization, I prefer to speak through the patient organization because that has the greatest impact. So I see the PLS as the ultimate way to empower the patient organizations that are in our group. So I did not properly introduce the organization, but the World Alliance of Pituitary Organization is a global organization. We bring not individuals together, but global pituitary organizations on around the globe. So we may have small number of organizations, but we represent countries. And as such, the sharing of scientific knowledge to the community is humongous, especially in those areas where such information is not available. Okay? And I'm thinking in certain regions where that is most necessary, not only for the empowerment of the patient, but also for certain healthcare professionals, such as nurses and GPs, who are actually closer to the patient than perhaps specialists may be. And the role that the patient organization has in dissemination is crucial, because we may receive the PLS in written format, but we have the ability and the capability to transform that in the best format for our community. So if we don't have any special impairments, we can transform this into a visual one, or we can leave it as is. If we have a community that has visual impairment, perhaps it is best to transform it into an audio clip, or perhaps to create a braille transcription of this, or perhaps to create a short video clip with subtitles. So we are the ones who really know how to best interpret the information and then spread it out. The most crucial part of this is that I, as a patient, I am empowered with the information. I can help not only myself make better choices, but I can also contribute significantly to the patient organization of which I may be part of. And by doing so, we contribute, we build trust with within the community, to research, to the industry, and to the various multi-stakeholders. That is so crucial. And in the end, what we want is to create greater retention when we talk about clinical trials. If I, as a general patient, have access to information which I know can help me improve my health, live longer, and improve my quality of life, hey, I just might get in touch with a patient organization and say, listen, I read this PLS, I'd like to know about that. And then the patient organization can then convey to the patient the right location to find additional information, or put them in contact with the right person. Okay, next slide. But like everything in life, there are pros and cons, and I wanted to also highlight the challenges that both sides have to face. So, as Irina said, her journal is open access, but not all journals are open access. There are often paywalls, and that is so frustrating. So frustrating, because I see something valuable and I can't access it. Sometimes it's only the abstract, and then I want to know more, and I can't go any further. Okay. As far as a patient organization, as a global organization, I can tell you that the format is not the only challenge. We also have to deal with language challenges. And yes, although English is the lingua franca in research, it doesn't mean that the patient community you are supporting has as much knowledge of it as anybody else, okay? So that's why it's important to understand that, okay, I have this PLS, it can bring great value to the community. Now I have to change it, not maybe only the format, but also the language, okay? And the other challenge for the patient organization is, well, you know, patient organizations are challenged in so many ways, now even more than before, because of the pandemic. We're talking about fundraising issues, finding volunteers, And also, is this going to be an extra workload for the patient organization, the people within it? Do they need extra skills? What skills? I can also see this as an opportunity because it means that the patient organization, if the community sees the added value, they can create educational sessions on this. What is the value? How to get involved? Who to contact? What do I need to do? So it is from a crisis, you can always learn and become more creative and seek opportunities. And last but not least, I want to say that I really, really, to the core of myself, believe that patient engagement leads to informed choices for the better quality of life. Quality of life is a concept that the first time I heard it was through my specialist. I learned it through life experience, what quality of life is. So never forget that. When somebody takes away something from you, that's when you realize that your quality of life has changed. Right? And you. Next. All right. And now on to Thomas.
Yes. Industry. As my fellow speakers, I'm not speaking for industry. I try to assume an industry perspective, but of course I have no mandate to speak for industry, and what I say is my opinion. It is not necessarily the opinion of my employer, and not of PFMD, of course. Of course, industry has an important interest in PLSS, and maybe if we go to the next slide. Daniela. Yes, because PLS offer many opportunities, and as you know, industry is opening up now and embracing communication and collaboration with patients. And in this context, that is fairly new for many pharma companies, PLS are really full of opportunities. And the key reason is they allow the understanding of science and particularly of clinical research to go beyond the usual expert group of experts, because they go beyond, they go potentially, as we heard before, to patients, caregivers, and the general public. And that includes people who then also transmit the information further. So like journalists, or as we heard from Sheila, patient organizations who then multiply the insights that science has gained. And of course, that is very important for a pharma company to reach the target audience, but also to go beyond that to share the news. PLS allowed the increase the reach and the visibility of clinical data, and that can be important for many stakeholders. The feature that PLS offer is that they make these clinical data available to the non-specialist. And of course, as we have heard before, the decision on the target audience is essential. So the people who provide or write these PLSs need to be clear who they target as their audience. But in any case, be it HCPs or patients or patient organizations, the clinical data that is being generated in clinical trials and the new information on diseases will be spread wider than before. And again, that is a very beneficial element for industry. In the same context, with the increase of audience, of course, the speed of spreading information about medical breakthroughs, and once in a while there are breakthroughs in therapies, increases. And so PLS may foster a quicker adoption of new therapies than traditionally, because the recipients are informed appropriately about the availability of new therapies or new approaches, and this may trigger a quicker uptake of these therapies in the medical practice. By informing patients and others and the general public appropriately on research and science, of course, PLS help to reduce misinformation and misunderstanding, and this is particularly important for people who then multiply information via different channels. By having good understanding of what the science really is about, maybe these crying headlines in the tabloids about the latest wonderful research may be avoided in the future a little more than we see today. What is very important for industry in its outreach to patient groups is that PLS that are written in a way that they are true to the data that is being presented will, and that's the hope, foster trust between pharma companies and potentially patients and patient advocates and the general public, because the clearer PLSs are and the more accessible results are, the better it is to talk about them, and that's the basis for trust. An area where Sheila has alluded to, but also what has been implemented in publishing and is currently being implemented in industry to various degrees, is of course that PLS allow an outreach to patients directly with the objective to co-create PLSs. As you know, for pharmaceutical industry in the European legal background, it's not easy to simply go to patients and work with them. We need to do this in a certain compliance and legal framework, and by building up capabilities to co-create PLSs, pharma companies and industry can actually get into direct contact to patients and patient groups, and therefore learn about their views on diseases and on research in general, on the particular research that is being presented, and they can set up co-creation schemes with the various patient groups. So that's a very important step, because it allows direct contact between a sponsor of, let's say, a clinical trial and patients with a certain disease. And of course, as Sheila has said, and also Elena, PLS can help the communication between the patient and his or her physician, because they make that they can discuss that with the physician and get maybe a different level of insight into the treatment options than they would have without a PLS. Okay, but with the opportunities, and the same as Sheila has said, let's go to the next slide. Of course, there are challenges, and many of them. And Elena has alluded to it already. So PLSs are still fairly new. Not all journals encourage PLSs. The ones that permit PLSs to require different formats, have different standards, have different ways of assessing those documents. So it's pretty wild, and it's difficult to maintain an oversight of what is actually happening. There is for industry, it's a big question. Should all articles have a PLS, or is it maybe more reasonable to reserve PLSs for publications on clinical data rather than on early research or preclinical data? That is being answered differently by various companies. Then again, for a pharma company, I know we work with scientific authors, and they are, by virtue of their profession, scientists, and that means that they're not necessarily well trained to write in a language that is accessible for patients and others, and therefore these authors need to be trained or supported. And of course, as we heard, it's quite a challenge for industry to organize the review by patients. You need to set up an entire structure for that. Then, of course, the question is, what are the best ways to distribute PLSs to various audiences, via the web, via social media? There are legal limitations to that, because it could, depending on the topic and on the way the PLS is written, could be seen as promotional, and therefore there are limitations. And then very importantly, and Elena has sort of alluded to that, we are here very much in an English context, and we're primarily focus on an English PLS, but of course, if you look into Europe and into the world, English is an important language and it's the language of science, but people would not read PLS in English, regardless of their quality. So the real meat in that is in translations. And the question is how to do them appropriately. Is this which languages to use and so on. That's a very, very big topic, I think, also for the entire endeavor of PLS. And then, of course, for pharma companies who have their traditional setup, bringing the functions together that help create scientific information, that the functions that have direct contact to patients and investigators, and the people who have start having conversations with patient organizations, creates some difficulty because these are usually not in one organizational unit, and this needs to be done should a PLS effort be successful, because you need to connect the various dots in the company. And that is quite some effort. I think some companies are still struggling in doing that. In the interest of time, that was my last observation.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Some really kind of interesting food for thought coming out there. So we now have about 15 minutes or so for a Q&A. I've seen some really good discussions coming through on the chat box. And I know some of the questions have kind of been answered in the chat box as we go along, but I've just got a few which I can pose to you as the panel. So I think a really key one which keeps coming up is, what's your experience in terms of using different formats for plain language summaries? So including things like visuals, maybe kind of video versions of plain language summaries. And do you think these could be more impactful for broader audiences? So I'm not sure who wants to start with that.
Let's start with Sheila.
So I don't have experience yet, but I can tell you that given the amount of time we spend on internet and mobile phones, our attention span has really, really diminished. So anything that could be in video format that highlights the key points or icons, that can really benefit and also help the reader really hone in on the information they need. And the video clips get the message across, so I'm all for it. Again, it depends on the who your audience is and if they have special needs, or if you simply think that the audience will benefit the best in a different, from a more traditional version that is written.
Thanks, Sheila. And I think I would also just add to that, we do now have evidence that including visuals and kind of having infographic formats for plain language summaries are preferred by audiences. So I think, there is kind of evidence now that that would be best practice to be thinking about how you can include visuals. Obviously, that's not always possible within the constraints of publication formats. But I think, it's important to think about how we can start incorporating them and supporting publishers to publish plain language summaries that do include those more visual or interactive elements.
We have started experimenting with videos, short videos, but it's very challenging because you need to, you need to think of audience focus, but again of cultural validity across various cultures. So actually doing videos on trials or on scientific data is really challenging. I think we've made a little bit of progress, but we're still in the infancy of actually doing that.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Elaine.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Okay. No, just 2 seconds on this. That we have, so some journals have video abstracts. These are not necessarily plain language video abstracts. So I just want to, there's a lot of interest from industry to have video abstracts. Again, the visuals really help. We've got some journals that also sometimes have infographic, or marketing teams, ask us to select a good paper and do an infographic. So I think the biggest challenge here is scaling it up. Can we do this for every article? Is it possible to do this? I think the will is there. yeah, the will is definitely there. It's just like, can we do it, and how much, you know? So I think we're starting small, essentially, seeing where that goes, and hopefully we'll be able to implement that much more.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the issue is if you do this once in a blue moon, first of all, you don't, you know, you need to relearn every time. Secondly, if you don't have a fairly strict rule for which scientific article you do that, you could be perceived as being, you know, picking your cherries, you know, only those data that you believe are, you know, helpful. And therefore, I think it needs also some, yeah, at least some rule, if not some ethical consideration of when is it appropriate to actually produce a video, and you know, then it must be done consistently across, let's say, a company's portfolio, and that, of course, is a challenge.
Yeah, so that was actually going to be my next question. Was around.
Sorry.
No, that was great. Is around, you know, we can talk about that in general. You know, what kind of criteria should we be using to select publications to produce plain language summaries for? Because I think the only kind of scenario in which there can be no perception of cherry picking is if you're doing them for every single publication, you know, every manuscript, every Congress presentation across the board, and kind of, you know, if that's not an option, how do we then select within them? So I guess maybe Thomas, you know, how have you approached this at BI? Kind of what does your process look like?
Yes, very, very good point. Well, we are in the middle of setting ourselves rules for doing that. It's really a critical question. Because it sort of, and that goes a little bit beyond PLS, it focuses around what is patient relevant, because that would be one moderating term. You could say, okay, we're doing this for all those data, all those data sets, or all those outcomes that are relevant for patients, but then you need to define what that is. And we have, you know, tentatively settled on something. We would focus on projects in late stage development. So let's say phase 3 data and phase 3 clinical data predominantly, not so much preclinical, or not at all preclinical. We would really, because our belief is it should be somehow useful for a patient to read that and to get to know it. And the early stuff, most of that never, you know, sees the light of the day in the market. So that's not helpful. So we thought about anything in the context of a phase 3 that actually is meant to lead to registration at some point. But this is sort of the working idea we have.
Yeah, no, those are both really good points. I think kind of around the question of what's relevant to the audience that you're targeting these at, the best way is to ask them, you know, so to be thinking about, you know, bringing together a steering committee to maybe kind of, you know, look at whichever criteria you're thinking about using. And I guess the other point I would make was that it might be quite specific to different therapy areas. So maybe for communities with rare conditions where there aren't any treatment options, maybe the earlier phase data might be of interest to them. So I think it can be quite nuanced depending on exactly what the area is.
Yeah,
so it's definitely not one answer to that question.
No. You're absolutely right. It gets very difficult if you look at orphan diseases. That's a difficult topic.
And we've got a couple of questions around access to plain language summaries and how we can make sure that they're found. So that was actually a question for Elena. You know, in terms of beyond the question of open access, how can we make sure that audiences can find PLS?
It's a brilliant question, actually, and it's something we've been talking about a lot as well. So as I mentioned, Twitter is one of them. I know it's not the all and beyond, like, you know, the only source, but what I mentioned in my quick presentation is also, I'm hoping that through collaboration with other patient organizations, this is how I'm envisaging, hopefully, it basically expanding. So I really, you know, the open access certainly helps, but we need to do more, because if you have an open access article but no one talks about it, what's the point, right? So we do want to, you know, use social media, use blog posts, promote it as much as possible, you know, and then also like talk to patient organizations. That's something we're really looking at this year, to collaborate, to build relationships with patient organizations, to basically spread the word and the PLS.
That's great. And I think as well, the question is, how do people find these online? And the question of what is the role of PubMed, I think for me is quite a big one in terms of, do non-scientific audiences go to PubMed? Can you find PLS within PubMed? Because obviously they do now have the PLS meta tag, and how, that might evolve. Because for me, that's a bit of a grey area. I don't kind of fully understand how they do it.
No,
and I think, so just to add, I think it's very, very important, and I have seen various things out there that, if PLSs are posted or forwarded in social media, that they retain a link to the original article. Sometimes it's really just a PLS, and you don't even know where the original article was. And I think that's close to misinformation, because I think the link between the true scientific article and the PLS needs to be maintained, even in social media communications. And I've seen people failing to do that.
Yeah, I think that's something we would always recommend. If the PLS is going to be somewhere separate from the main article, you need to have that link. We would also recommend a statement around whether it's open access or not, so you won't get a nasty shock when you click the link.
Yeah, that is one of the reasons also that we've integrated the PLS within the article. It's not perfect, and I know there's other ways of doing that, but initially that was exactly our thoughts. We want for people to see the article, but also have the PLS integrate, so they have to look elsewhere. Right, so at least it's integrated, it's there. There's pros and cons to this, of course, but so far it's worked quite well.
Yeah, that's good. And we've got quite a logistical question around actually, how PLS development happens alongside the timeline of manuscript development. So I can say, kind of from my experience at Medical Communications Agency, it's always a balance between obviously basing the PLS on the final content, but also making sure that it can be done in time, because you're ideally looking to submit it with the manuscript. Or if you're, have them submitted to a congress, you have to be very mindful of, the timelines in terms of presentation. But in terms of maybe PLS that are maybe authored by the journal, I don't know whether you have any insights onto kind of how that's done. Are they done in, how is that done? Or,
Well, we do it. We do it. Not in a very structured way. It depends really on the therapeutic area, and of course, it depends also on the data at hand and on the authors that are involved. And if we try, and that's not always successful, but we try to engage patients in the design of the research. So very early on. And we've started to do this in a few therapeutic areas. And if we have a rapport with the patient organizations, we would involve them very early in the manuscript writing, right from the start of the writing, and what is important, and what do you believe is the important news here. But we also have still cases, as Sheila has pointed out, where patients are only included in the review of a PLS. Mm-hmm. So it's the whole range of in-betweens as well. We're not there yet. Yeah.
Okay. And then we've got time for one final question. And something which has come up quite extensively is, how do you handle translations and kind of the challenges that poses? So I think any experience that someone has would be of value to the group.
So maybe I can take that. So that's a key point for us as well. And usually, because it is a PLS, we also have a medical advisory board. So we rely on our patient community, and then sometimes, because sometimes the advisory board is also multilingual, we double check with them, or the patient in their own country verify with a doctor in turn. So we rely on our community, and otherwise we have in-kind support. So it depends on the situation, but translation is a key. And sometimes the board members itself, it's a global organization, they speak different languages. So our board has at least 4 different languages. There's English, Dutch, Italian, Russian, Spanish, yeah, so you can see that already there's a variety of languages that we can take advantage and share with the community.
I can only, my experience is really more with trial-lay summaries, but nevertheless, translations is a very difficult topic because as I guess Sheila is having the same experience. You can translate something, but to translate something well, and I think the more patient focused the translation should be, it becomes really intricate. Yeah, because there are differences between, let's say, French and France and French and Canada. Yeah, so and you need to be aware of that. And if you really want to be informing patients, and it's a real challenge to do this well. Yeah, this is, it needs a lot of organization, and this is also money a point. Yeah, it costs money.
Yeah, so if I can just add with regards to the variation of the languages, our standard is to start off with the standard UN languages. So there's French, there's Arabic, there's Russian, and so we go with that mainstream. And then if the patient organization who speaks French in Canada receives the French version from Paris and they want to adapt it to their community, well, that's up to the patient organization. But I don't think the variation is that big. Different issue is perhaps using jargon or colloquialisms, but science is science, and you want to get the right message across as clearly as possible. So.
Great. So I think, yeah, that's a really good point to end on. We've had way more questions than we could answer in this time. I think we needed about 3 times longer. But what we will do is capture the transcript of the questions and take them back to the working group as a whole, just so that we can consider them, because I think it's just so important, that we're getting feedback from you guys as the broader community and being able to kind of take that back and work with it. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to go into the interactive session where we are all going to be magically moved into breakout rooms.
Let's hope it works.
Yeah.
Yes, give me 1 second. I'm setting it up.
Yeah,
sure.
Easy.
So as Daniela sets that up, each session, each group will have a moderator, 2 moderators, and we will work with you. We want your input, so time to...
Maybe methodology is, we have one example, PLS, which should be critiqued by the various groups. So we want you to critique the PLS and what is good, what is not so good, what can be learned for a better PLS. This will be the objective of the breakouts.
Yeah. Thank you, Thomas.
Welcome. So magic happens at some point.
So each of the moderator will come back with key takeaways in the plenary.
Yeah.
And then we go to the final key messages.
Positives, what are the negatives, what could be improved? Yeah, let's just discuss. Well, I'll leave you to it for a few minutes so you can have a read. Give me a little wave if you finished reading, if that was enough time, or if not, I can leave you to it.
Yeah, hi Elena, it's nice to see you.
Hi Paula, great to see you too.
I have a couple of considerations, but I wait for the rest to finish before we start.
Sure.
You tell me when.
Yeah, I mean, I hope people have managed to read it so far. But yeah, please do share your thoughts. I'd be very happy to hear them.
Okay, 2 points come to my mind. First, that bullet points could have been used to make it clearer and sort of easier to read, sort of lighter. And second, the conclusion could have been maybe written a different, maybe with a blue box or something that stands out from the rest.
So highlighted, essentially.
See, highlighted.
Okay.
Hi, Elena. This is Purvi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I think for me, when I read it, I felt in terms of health literacy, it was still scientific and not 6th to 8th grade reading level. No, similar to lay summaries. For example, I'll just pick on what is control group. For patients, it's difficult to understand what is control group and stuff. So just few aspects that could be considered. And yeah, I agree. If the intent is to one page, maybe more even graphics could be added here if possible.
And I guess that does raise a good point as well in terms of, are we aiming for the same reading level as the clinical trial results lay summaries, or is this a different audience? So I guess that's a question that for me comes up a lot. So if anyone has any thoughts about that.
Well, one thing you could do is maybe have some sort of link or pop-up window or something that explains some medical terms, you know, so for the general knowledge.
Yeah. And I think it all depends on the audience, Laurie, too, right? If it is for study participants or public, and if it is going on social media, then not everybody is tech savvy too, right? Or scientific savvy, I mean. And therefore, making it more digestible does make sense, especially for the intent of us creating PLS. Otherwise, we already have a scientific document.
Yeah, I do agree. One thing that I also think for plain language summaries of publication is that, you know, unlike the lay language summary, the clinicaltrials.gov, you don't have another abstract on clinicaltrials.gov. That's kind of the only thing that you can read, right, that's going to be clear for the patient. But for the plain language summary of a publication, there is already an abstract on the publication, which is presumably written in non-plain language summary, you know, more complex language that's more suitable to an expert in the field. So I think that, you know, Purvi's right, language like control group, dispensing errors, even self-administration, which is the very first word of the title here. I think that, you know, it'd be easy to think of plain language examples or, terminology that you could use in place of that would be more accessible to someone without scientific background.
Elena, this is Abhishek from Novartis. One thing I noticed, and this is from my experiences, I think the so what question, does it kind of clearly call out what does it mean?
What's the purpose? Or...
Yes, I mean, what does it mean for the reader? I mean, so what we typically do is we avoid this IMRAD kind of background method, result, conclusion structure. We talk about it. What was the study about? How did they do it? What did they find? And so what? What does it mean? Okay. And that kind of brings them, I think that has a sense of that, you know, they're talking to, somebody's talking to them, and it kind of gets a better reaction than a standard. But having said that, I don't know what the journal prescribed in terms of guidance to the authors when it comes to this structure. So they
and Abhishek, when you do that,
yes, Iman. Yes, Iman.
When you do that, do you have like a restriction that you can only include information in the PLS that was in the original publication?
Absolutely.
Or
Absolutely.
you know,
just that.
What does it mean? Do they add a little bit of interpretation?
No. Then our compliance and legal folks will be up our this thing.
Right.
So it's still from the discussion bit. So whatever is there in the discussion part of the paper, that part is pretty much, I think, redone to show what. So it's not implications. So what does it mean? So it's essentially what should the reader take away from the fact that this trial reported this?
Yeah.
You know, it's
not.
not.
I think. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I agree with that. So we aim to keep the sort of conclusions very neutral, because what you're not trying to do is then extrapolate how you think it could be important to patients, because that's kind of starting to get into slightly more grey territory. I think if you wanted to do that, you would need to involve a patient in actually authoring the manuscript and bringing their interpretation, and then that could feed through to the PLS, but it's not something we're trying to, you know, kind of guess what a patient might think in that context.
When I read this, in the conclusion section, when there's a line, in addition, SAM had positive impact on a perception regarding medication. That's suggesting, I think we always try to avoid that, you know, in terms of drawing a very vague conclusion is suggesting increased medical adherence, right? I think it's,
Yeah, this is Linda. I also think there's just way too much information.
Mm-hmm.
I think it could just be really stripped back, and yeah, definitely it would benefit from bullets and questions.
Okay. So do you feel like in that sense it should be shorter, or just much simpler in the sense, because there's sometimes the worry that if you do make it shorter, or, you know, only kind of, you know, write about the basics, and then some of it is lost. Like, for example, limitations. There's no limitations here. Would you not even, would you kind of include that? So I see exactly what you're saying, but I'm wondering whether there's a happy medium between stripping it back, which I completely agree with, but also making sure that enough information is there that reflects the article or the research itself.
I think it shouldn't be shorter.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it could be a little bit longer, but not shorter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yes,
and I
I
think
agree.
that what Abhishek said was a really good point. I think that this is trying to be an abstract in simple language, but what Abhishek was suggesting seems to me a much more logical format and structure for a plain language summary. You know, asking the question, what were the researchers trying to establish? What did they find? What does it mean? You know, to me as a person, that's an easier way of reading and interpreting the information, as opposed to having methods, results, and conclusions.
Yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, learning how the structure is for researchers is important, because one day, if you want to write, for example, an abstract or you know, some literature, or if you want to present a poster, you need to follow these different points. So at the same time, you're learning how to do it.
I agree, but I don't think that that's the objective of a plain language summary, to train people in how a scientific abstract would be laid out. I think the objective has to be, you know, exactly what it says, to be a summary in plain.
But to be honest, I also don't think that all patients would look for literature on clinical trials. Already the patients that want to look for literature on clinical trials are patients that are already a little bit a step higher, and also they want to get informed. So informing themselves are probably better educated than the lay patients, so to speak.
Okay. Well, yeah, it's interesting to hear like different views on this, actually. So it seems to be a really good group with different views. And is there anything else anyone's noticed that they either appreciate or feel like something's missing? Is there anything else that really crops up for you?
I think something from my perspective is around kind of the language being patient focused or not. So for example, you know, it's saying patients or participants rather than people with a condition as a kind of a basic example. Or, you know, concepts such as adherence, kind of whether someone's deviating from their medication. Like, it's kind of a lot of the language which we hear, you know, that maybe patients or patient groups don't necessarily appreciate as much. So it's, you know, maybe thinking about, obviously then that kind of opens out the question of if they're not just for patients, but I think, you know, everyone can benefit from having a more kind of patient-focused approach to the language, because I think that can help with general communication as well. So that was just something that I noticed.
Yeah. So, I mean, from what I hear from the feedback so far is that this is still a bit, you know, the language is still not what it needs to be for a patient. Is that what I'm hearing? Yeah. Okay. Yep. Excellent. Okay.
But then, Elena, sorry, one last thing. Sorry, so much.
Well, just I'll point it out, and then I'll let you go. But I think Laurie makes a really good point. There's two ways that language can be sort of plain, if you like. There's plain language, and then there's patient-friendly language, or appropriate language. And I think we need to make sure we're doing both. We need to avoid confusing terms like administration, which might not be well understood, and then we need to avoid using a deviation, for example, which might not be well received.
Oh, you're breaking up a little bit. Oh, no, you've muted yourself. Okay, yeah, no, I mean, I think it's from a publishing perspective, I think it's a bit sometimes difficult to know which level, because obviously there's so many different types of, or backgrounds, as Paola mentioned as well, and who are you trying to cater for? Of course, this is a plain language summary, so you're trying to make it simpler, and this is not a great example for that. You want it to be, clearly understandable. But yeah, so it's interesting to hear all these different opinions on that, and it can be, again, I'm speaking from a publishing perspective here, it can be sometimes difficult to assess how far to go or not. So, so what you're saying is incredibly interesting, and so it's interesting to know, because we did choose, for example, this example in particular because we felt that this was more accessible. But now we're speaking to you, and turns out it's not. So this is great feedback.
That's a question as well as, once you've got your patient peer review panel set up, did this one go through patient peer review, or does this sort of predate the panel? Because then you might get, different feedback.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is predating. This is the very first PLS, and that's why I think it's also a good example. This is the very first PLS we published, and that's why it kind of just really shows how important it is to have PLS reviewers. So again, we do instruct the authors, but obviously they won't know until they have someone reviewing and assessing it, and obviously here this was still too complex. And so that's why we so appreciate the PLS reviewers and, the advisory board, collaborating with us, because that's hopefully what we'll get to, where, the language will be, patient accessible essentially.
Yeah, and I think, it's about not feeling bad about that. It's a learning curve for everybody. And no. I think it's the fact that, you have to start somewhere with this. So I kind of look back on the ones that we were doing a couple of years ago, and I'm like, oh, did I write that? And I think it's kind of, being a bit humble about that, and just, accepting that it's going to be a learning process, and taking the feedback on board from user testing and just kind of learning from it, rather than worrying that you didn't get it right the first time around. Because I think just the fact that people are starting to do these is important. And then over time, as standards come in, and, more kind of guidance around how to make the quality more consistent, I think that will come. It's just getting them published and getting them started. That's the key thing for me.
No, anyway. Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And again, that's why I think I hopefully really emphasized during my presentation that this is definitely a learning curve, and we're learning. And to hear the feedback is incredible. And it's so important to us. And also it's been great, I have to see in the publishing experience, that actually it's been, so we were a bit concerned initially also of authors being maybe annoyed to have to do additional work, or, I mean, not that that would have changed anything, because it's now it's a requirement of the submission. However, everyone's just, whether they're good PLS or not, they are submitting them. And, it's been a very positive experience, and, the editors have been very happy with this and very supportive. So it's been great, but of course there's still a lot of work to do. And thankfully, we've got both the Envision toolkit actually, which is something we'll be linking to in our guidelines, and the PFMD guide. So hopefully that will be hugely helpful to authors doing this. And then we've got the PLS reviewers who will be assessing and checking them and making sure they read well for the audience that it's intended for.
Elena, thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say thank you very much, because it's incredibly helpful certainly for pharma and UCB in particular, which obviously I'm working for UCB. But it also gets over the compliance hurdles, because if it's mandated by the journal, then there's no conversation that goes on. And I think that will make our lives so much easier, and be able to embrace this much more quickly if this is adopted by other journals. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's great to hear that. And I did, yeah, like I mentioned previously, we get so many inquiries about this. You know, do you accept PLS? And it's especially from industry, we've seen this a lot. Do you accept PLS? Do you publish a PLS? And it's becoming much more, obviously, a requirement in clinical trials and industry. So this is us also being compliant to that, because obviously we're publishing these papers. So yeah, it makes sense. And then it's great to hear that that's actually positive for industry as well.
No, Alan, and Abhishek here. I know that we have been obviously critical of this, but then I think Laurie brought up a good point, that because when you said, is there anything positive here? I said, and the thing that came to my mind was that the fact that this is out in the paper is a step forward. I mean, I think the fact that we have come to this stage where I think everybody's thinking and talking about it, and there's a way forward. I mean, a question that came up at the ISMAP Open, the roundtable was, we don't have any regulations. The trial lay summaries have regulations. So how do we manage these? In these circumstances, the guidance from the publishers and journals and self-regulation is all we have. So whatever comes in from you, and it's going to evolve over with your experience and those who are submitting it. But I think it's a good step forward. No matter what, we always look back and say this could be better, but I think anything we do in this direction is obviously going to take us in a different level.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I'm under the impression that PLS are going to be included in GPP4 when that's released. So I think that will hopefully be a massive help for everyone in terms of saying that we can do them and providing some guidance. So I think that would be, for me, the next step. Because I think obviously our kind of like the PFMD Howto guide, like the toolkit that my group developed, that's a form of self-regulation, and that can only go so far. You need the kind of the industry-wide level to sort of take it forward. But I completely agree with Linda that if the pull is coming from the journals, that is massive for us, in terms of opening up plain language summaries. So yeah, thanks for doing that work.
No, it's truly wonderful to hear. And as I said, I'm sure it comes across. It's my passion project, and I'm so excited to be involved in this. And I do hope, it will grow, and I think it will. It's looking really good. So I just wanted to thank you all for your feedback. We're now in the last 5 to 4 minutes. So I just wanted to round up this discussion and ask you what the 3 key things were here from this discussion. So obviously we've heard a lot about the language in this PLS, that wasn't, adapted enough. Is there anything else we would like to put as the 3 main points, for this discussion?
Would also add maybe more bullets or crisper message.
Yes, so structure. So structures could be better structure, okay.
And I guess the visuals would fit in with that, kind of the general points about format and structure.
And I found the pop-ups for a little bit difficult words very good. So someone understands it, can just go through, and the other person can.
Yeah. So more if there are some words to basically add a definition or some kind of glossary, or someone mentioned a pop-out, which I think is brilliant. Actually, that would look great. Yeah.
I would say like a hover. If you hover over certain words, that it automatically pops up with the definition.
Yes. Yeah. That would be excellent, actually. Yeah. What else? Accessible. Yeah, I mean, I think those were the 2 main, points.
Questions as well, to put it into
questions
a question format.
That's right.
I think really from Abhishek's point of view.
Yes, I think that's really good.
Yeah. Good point. So we have, the language and, definitions, it wasn't adapted enough. And, for example, we could have like a hover where we can see definitions. The structure, so maybe more bullet points, highlighting of conclusion, as well as infographics, if possible, some visual aids. And third, so question, the structure where it's not IMRAD, or questions that make it much more clear what the message is, what this paper was talking about. And so that's very clear from the structure. Is everyone happy with that? Is there anything else you would like to add?
I just think it would be interesting at some point to see like this one example in multiple different formats and have it assessed by multiple groups of people of who, you know, who has access to it, to look at what's good, what are the good points, what are the bad points, what, you know, so we're not looking at just one example, but we're looking at multiple examples and then pulling what's best from each of them and what's appropriate.
So with, like, for example, different structures or an infographic, is that what you're saying? So the same one in different kind of... In
different layouts, different formats, different accessibility, who's the audience?
Yeah, no, definitely. So that's certainly something we'll be looking at. And as I said, this session has been hugely helpful for that. I've seen loads of comments in the chats as well. I mean, it seems like the interest is really there, which is really great to hear and see. And I was wondering, I don't know if you still have time or if it's going to close on us, but I was wondering if anyone else... Oh, no, we're closing. Okay, it was great to work with you all. I'll see you back in the main room. Thank you very much for your feedback. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elena.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, so who's...
I can start if you like.
Yeah, Thomas, let's start.
Thomas.
Okay, good. Yep. We had a good discussion. I liked it. The group was good and active. So we thought, actually, I think in summary that this PLS is not a good example of a good PLS. And the reason being, you know, the sections were perceived as being good, but the way they were structured, we thought this is not really for patients. And this was, I think, the general impression that the whole thing was written without having anybody in mind who would read that, because it was not clear who the audience was at all. The language was anything but lay friendly. We had sentences of about 50 words in the PLS. And I think what was also commented on, people found the section on limitations of the trial would have been important. So what are the limitations of the conclusions? And people also expressed that the abstract or the PLS should have numbers, and because the whole PLS had not a single
number.
Oh, Thomas. We're doing
it's like
so
we
well.
lost.
Yeah.
It seems like we lost Thomas.
There is
he was mentioning about in the group that people thought that numbers were absent, and it wasn't quite clear what the results were. I mean, that the audience was referring to a lay audience. It looked more like people who are already familiar with the studies.
Thomas, are you back?
Oh, I think he disconnected. He'll come back.
Yes.
Okay. Shall we move to the next one?
Sheila or Elena?
Yeah, I mean, the first point was kind of identical to Thomas's. The group it was a great discussion, but we felt like the language was too scientific, that it would have been great to have a glossary or even like a link to medical terms where you hover over it, which would be amazing. So that was one of the points. The second point was the structure. It would have been nice to have more bullet points so that the messages were clear, and maybe a highlighting of the conclusion or the main message of the basically of the research. And of course, infographics are always useful as a visual aid. And last but not least, also the kind of IMRAD structure. Abhishek pointed out that would have been nice if it was more questions. So what is this? Who was it for? So more of a, kind of a question and answer to make it much more clear what the message is and what was done. And again, here we need to remind ourselves that this is who the audience is. So again, what Thomas alluded to. Yeah, I mean, there were some great suggestions on what we could do instead. But yeah, up to you, Sheila. I don't know what your group, if they agreed with this.
We had very similar points. Our group was equally very interactive, and they were very much against this chock-a-block structure that it reminded some of them of the actual scientific articles. One participant suggested that besides making these key points more discursive, like Why did we do this? What is the value? To bring the actual key point at the very top. Like this research managed to identify 3 new benefits of blah, blah, blah. So that the person rather sees the value in that than an adapted title. Okay. Then using, of course, maybe icons, bullet points was not mentioned, but of course that's easy. And then I asked a question about, had there been numbers, what would have happened to if it was like going from a very specific number that is usually in scientific articles to something more rounded off? And so one participant suggested that perhaps we could put the lay version in the text and put the exact number in parentheses, so that there's still validation to the text. And if we were to keep this version here, obviously bigger font and yeah, it's just too contracted. I don't know if I have missed anything, Anne-Marie?
No, I think a call for having more flexibility on the creation of PLS, and I think it's maybe a call for the editors on. And I like one of the ideas that come over of a kind of, why not to have a template, you know, if we have, let's say, a general template. I think it would be helpful also on the patient side, because the patient side would find a kind of structure where they will get more familiar, where maybe they can be trained as well. And I think on the initiator owners, it's also about to making things simple and not to over complexify all the process. So I think it was one interesting idea to capture.
Okay. And the last 2 points were, one regarded the use of the passive tense in scientific articles and convert that into more active. And the very last one was the fact that perhaps all the journals should eventually come to an agreement and use either the same platform or the same system. So structure, etc., to create like a standard. So that is something that will come in the future. I see Thomas is back.
Yeah, Thomas is back, yeah.
Thomas.
So practically we have 10 minutes left before we close the workshop. So Thomas, do you want to say something specific to the feedback here on the PLS interactive session? I think we struggle to have him back.
I'm back. I'm back.
Ah, okay. You want to say something regarding the feedback of the interactive session, because otherwise we move to the close. But the floor is up to you.
Yeah. Well, did you hear my summary of the results of the group?
Part of it.
Part of it.
Yeah.
Okay, I just repeat. So it should have numbers. It should have a section on limitations. The audience is totally unclear. You know who the audience should be of this PLS. I think, and the language is anything but lay. And it could have done with a graphic. Potentially a graphic would have helped. In summary, that was the feedback.
Okay.
Very clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then we can move to the next step and the close. I invite the 3 contributors to give a kind of key takeaways of the session. Okay, your feelings, what are you taking back to the working group or for yourself, and then I will conclude if that works. Sheila, you start.
Okay, so I really enjoyed this virtual version, although I must prefer that I would have liked to do some happy hour networking afterwards. but we'll figure it out next year. I really enjoyed the breakout session because it was interactive and we got some expected and some new feedback, so that's good. And yeah, it's more points to implement and evaluate how to incorporate in the how-to guide.
Elena?
For me, I mean, this is the first time I do this session, and it's been absolutely a fantastic couple of hours. Great questions, great considerations. The breakout group was really great as well. Like really, you know, people had a lot to say. There's a lot of interest, which is so great to see. And in terms of coming from a publisher perspective, I have learned so much, and there's so much I'm going to take on board and relate back to, you know, the publisher. Obviously, as I said, there's a lot to learn still, but this has been really great. And there's been also in the breakout group a lot of great feedback. Whilst the lay summary wasn't perfect, you know, people felt in general that it was great that this was happening. And, you know, people have to start somewhere. And the fact that there was a plain language summary is a step in the right direction. So overall, it's been very positive, and I've learned a lot. So thank you all to all the contributors today.
I can only chime in. Thank you. It's been a very good experience. Thank you to Daniela and Bonaventura to, you know, working in the background. This is very important. I think what my main learning is really, I think we need to go back and think about the audience focus. I think, you know, the choice of the audience, I think, and maybe the conscious choice of who the intended reader is it needs to drive the way how the PLS is being written, and I think that for me we should potentially integrate in the how-to guide. And it's been a great experience. I loved being part of it. Thank you to everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So on my side, on the behalf of PFMD, I really liked the experience, and all the group knows that I was a little bit nervous about going virtual with that. But I think it was a great opportunity to probably meet people that could not have come to the open forum in Brussels, so let's say on a live session. And I think what is important now is that we have a community. We are not only the working group, we have much more people where we see that there is a high level of interest in PLS, but also knowledge. I was really surprised with the quality of the intervention, the kind of critical questions that come over, but also the comments, like on the interactive session. So definitely there is a call for supporting us. And the next slide, can I have the next slide? I think there is a next slide. Yeah, okay. I just want to say that we are working on, let's say that ambition to deliver a guidance on how to engage patient together with the multiple stakeholder in the development of plain language summaries. What we have heard here today is that definitely there is a need. How to structure it, organize it, it's another story. We are conscious that it's important we collect all the feedback, and definitely the questions that we got during part one will return in the working group for further discussion and to see how we manage that. If you are interested to join our efforts, because what's coming on now in the next step, there is an important milestone where the delivery of the guidance will go first in a public consultation. And we really invite you to come and give us your feedback, what you think you have, what we have done. Is it user-friendly? Is it interesting for you? Is it impactful? Will you use it? And so on. So it's very important we get that before we go live. So before we really collect all that feedback through the public consultation. And then for end of the year, we will be in a position to make it available to all the communities that are interested. And also for the beginning of next year, we are already thinking about piloting. So if you are interested to pilot guidance on how to involve patients in the consolidation of PLS, we are interested to have to be in contact with you, and but that's coming a little bit later. So I think the great message, we have a community behind us. We will keep in contact with you. I just would like to remember that there will be an evaluation survey of that workshop that will reach you in the following days. And let's say thank you for your time. Thank you for your interest and the curiosity here. I think it was a great session. I'm very pleased.
Yeah, it was great.
Thank you for
everyone.
that, and have a nice weekend. You all deserve it.
Yeah, we stay on, don't we?
Yeah, we
Anne-Marie,
stay on.
we stay on. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.